Welcome to the Executives Lounge. This is your podcast host, Christine Fauner. I am bringing you amazing stories from amazing women in leadership from across the globe. Let's get started. I sit down with Marielle, and she and I talk about some pretty serious stuff in this episode. We talk about topics such as depression, suicidal thoughts, substance abuse, and depression. Please listen with care. This episode is also a little longer, and bear with us because there's a lot of good information in here, a lot of reflective thought that goes into some of these issues, and they're just big issues to bite. And so I hope you decide to choose some of them with us. No, I'm excited to catch up because I feel like the first time we chatted, there was like so much more I wanted to talk about, but we were so short on time, and it's just really great to get to know you. And so on a personal level, I've just been really looking forward to today.
It's great to be here, and it's great chatting with you and just being part of this. I really believe in what you're doing. So just very happy to be here. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I am here today with Dr. Marielle Reataza. She comes to us out of Los Angeles, specifically Alhambra, if you're familiar with LA, northeast of Los Angeles. She is the executive director of the National Asian Pacific American Family Against Substance Abuse, which is a nonprofit organization founded in 1988. And this nonprofit organization is dedicated to mental health advocacy through their research, public health and policy reform, and community empowerment. As executive director, Marielle leads an organization that is committed to spreading awareness of substance use to prevent and reduce substance use disorder in Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. Dr. Reataza is a strong advocate for health and healthcare system reform in the United States. When she and I first met, we really got on this topic, and it was incredibly inspiring. She believes that behavioral health is an important piece of wellness and should be prioritized in public health policy and advocacy. Her experience as an immigrant from the Philippines and her background in education, medicine, research, health policy, and law inform her interdisciplinary approach to advocacy for health and wellness. She's also incredibly passionate about dismantling the stigma communities face in addressing mental health. I know that was a large introduction, Marielle, but you've done some large and amazing things. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Christine. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you for the very generous introduction. I appreciate that.
Well, I just feel like your story has many layers. You mention in the introduction the interdisciplinary approach, and I think that comes from the intersectionality of who you are and what your experience has been. And so I felt like I can't shorten it. It's got to be what it is. Everybody needs to know this. And I'd really love it as an intro for you to be able to tell us your story and how you got where you are today.
Yeah, thank you. It's definitely a long story, so I'm going to do my best to hit the high points because there's a lot to share, as you said. But all of these parts are so important to, how I got here today. I would generally say that I do the work that I do now because I was looking for the same kind of help, or I recognized that, my communities needed this kind of help. Um, and I think it comes from like that selfish need, right? It's like I don't have the resources, and what happens is you kind of start looking around, and then you talk to other people and they're like, well, I don't have the resources either. We're like, oh, we're also looking for the same thing. And I think there's something really important and magical about that kind of connection that I just realized was a part of what I saw in my life's work and my mission work, whatever that would be. And so I guess, how did I get into mental health and substance use disorder prevention, public health, health policy? So as an immigrant, I came to LA in the early 90s. Like I didn't really understand a lot of American culture. I barely spoke English. I always tell people, and this is the truth, that I started to learn English thanks to Whitney Houston's cassette, Greatest Love of All. Like she's like, I believe that children are the future. I was like, I am a children
And
that
I
is,
am the future.
I am the future. And I took it literally, I was like, I better do something. I used to sit in my mom's car and just like play it. She never drove the car, but she had the cassette player. So that's where I was playing it. And so, you know, uh, fast forward. So I'm in the US, I'm in LA, and I'm navigating all of these like systems with my parents. I'm 5 years old. And so I'm still relatively young, but old enough to kind of understand, okay, this is what's happening. So and I share this openly, I wasn't documented, and so was my mother for some time. And she had to work under the table. My mom, my stepdad, and I were living in a studio apartment in Koreatown, and it was tough. And so, kind of early on, I realized that things were very different as far as life was in Los Angeles or the US versus Philippines, because even though Philippines is considered this third world, or I like to call it a developing country, we had some kind of level of comfort. And so I always was puzzled when I was really young that like my mom gave up all of this to come to the US. And I think now in retrospect, now that I'm her age, when she came here with me, it's you kind of think about the sacrifices and the haves and the have nots, and what people have access to, what people don't have access to, and what kind of life-changing opportunities happen when you have access to things. And so I just saw that growing up. I saw my parents hustling. We moved all the time because the rent would go up. And so we had to, avoid the rent increases by moving to another apartment complex, sometimes to a different unit in the same apartment complex. And so I didn't really have a lot of stability. And that was just part of like what I understood. And so as I was going through school, I was always kind of smart. I mean, I tested as one of like the gifted kids. And I always like to think that gifted is actually more of like a special ed, but on the other direction. I really feel that, and so but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't really have like a one focus thing. I think, it was always perplexing to me how like high school students would be like, I want to do this when I grow up. And I was like, I have no idea, and around the time in high school, at the time, Governor Brown had this program where if you ranked like the top 2.5 percentile of your class, on standardized testing, that you would get automatic acceptance into one of the UCs. And the UC that I got accepted to because I qualified was UC Irvine. So I told my mom, I was like, well, I mean, that's great, but I don't know what I want to do. I don't know what I want to do. Like, why would I commit to all of this student debt, which I'm still talking about, when I could just go to community college and figure myself out? And my mom said, no. You are going to UC Irvine, and that's it. And so that's exactly what I did. And then I went to, I told her, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go undeclared. And she said, no, you're going to go as a biology major, which is exactly what I did. And
This, I'm going to be honest, Marielle, I grew up across the street from a Filipino family, and this sounds very much like a Filipino mother.
yeah, yeah,
Not to stereotype, right? But I mean, oh, no, you're not. You're doing this.
it's true. It's true. I mean, like, I think, I always laugh, like my parents didn't push me into nursing. Because let me tell you about how many, like, if you have been in a hospital in the Southern California region, chances are you have been treated by one of my family members as a nurse. I guarantee. But so, I had to, I did what my mom said. And, for me, actually, like, I trained in art when I was younger. And so, I was like, okay, it's just another instance of my parents crushing my dreams. Like, okay, I'm just, I'm just used to this now. But, it kind of retrospect, right? It kind of set me on this path. I ended up staying in biology, and I actually even subspecialized in biochemistry and molecular biology. I started doing research as an interdisciplinary research fellow. I mean, I didn't even know what research was. The extent of research that I understood was research when you did a book report. And suddenly in college, I was like, people like do this like for real. And then I started to understand like, oh, this is how these systems work. And it kind of just occurred to me, that as an immigrant, right, when you're just moving here and you're trying to survive, you're doing as much as you can, and most of that energy is poured into just paying bills, right? Um, you don't know what's out there for you. You can't envision yourself as like a scientist because it doesn't even enter your brain space, and so I started to see all of these opportunities come up. I started to just realize like, wow, they have had all this tutoring, they've had all these access to programs. Like, I don't know how any of this works. And so I found myself really stumbling a lot. And eventually I decided like, okay, I'm going to stick in science. I like research. I like health. I like education. And then, I got recruited by Teach for America, and they're like, hey, do you want to teach science? And I was like, oh, a summer school program. What is this? I didn't even know what Teach for America was. And they're like, oh, we're a nonprofit organization. And me being an immigrant, right? I was like, I don't really understand nonprofit. Like, is it free? Like, there's not a lot of discussion, right? Because when you're an immigrant, oftentimes, right, the main jobs like teacher, doctor, lawyer, all of the big names, just because they're the ones that tend to be prominent. Nowhere in my background of my family did they ever think like NGO or a nonprofit organization. And so, I just kept going with this, realizing like the power of access, the power of visibility, the power of representation. And I was teaching high school. I really, really loved it. And I was teaching in LA. I was teaching biology, AP biology, forensic science, which is a course that like I got to design on my own. It was a lot of work, but I liked to call it a privilege because it was fun to teach. But I realized, I was like, man, there is too much politics in education. And so let me just leave and go to a different field that has less politics, like healthcare. Well, I mean, this is how naive I was, right? Like, this is how, as an immigrant, like, I just didn't know how this worked. I had no idea. And so I left education thinking, oh, I'm going to go into healthcare. Fortunately, I got into medical school. And so I was in medical school thinking like, I'm going to do community health and like public health. And, it's like 2010. And my professors, my attendings are like, Marielle, that does not exist. You cannot do that as a doctor. And I was just so confused, because how can you tell me that as doctors, we don't interact as much in the public health, community health space? It was just so bizarre to me.
I mean, that's a really interesting point and perspective, right? I think a lot of us are so jaded and so like the healthcare system is so convoluted to all of us, and it's so confusing to all of us. I think it's really interesting that you came in thinking one thing, and then you realized, oh, the advocacy that happens is not because of me as a doctor, it's because of my knowledge in this space now as a doctor.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, what I took from that was so medical school is really, really hard, obviously, right? There's like so much curriculum to learn, but there's so much like science and like all of the different specialties to come through, that there's not a lot of time understanding how do we as providers, as practitioners, fit within the community.
That's a really great question. I want you to say it again. That is so profound.
So I'm going to try to remember. I have ADHD, so like things just fly out of my brain. But yeah, it occurred to me, right, that we needed to better understand how we as practitioners, as providers, as clinicians fit within the community.
Yeah.
Because we could have all of this like science and knowledge and technology and evidence-based practices, all of that. But if we don't understand our community, we're not meeting them where they are. And we're not actually going to help them, because what we're going to be doing is telling a story of what they're going through, which is oftentimes just not accurate. And what I saw in medical school, right? And there was a really big push for high board scores, because of course, right, the higher your board scores, the greater chances of you matching into your desired residency programs. And I think like they do it differently now. It's changed ever since COVID, like many things. But when you're a student and you're training in all of this, and all of your time, all of your formative like training, your early training is just like drilled that, hey, you just have to take tests, you just have to take tests, you have to do well, you have to do well. It really pulls us out of what it means to be in community. And what I saw was that there was a lot less desire to engage in dialogue and conversation with patients, because we were now looking more on data, on labs, on like other diagnostics. But we really forget that medicine and healing, right, what no matter what kind of provider you are, really starts at like, hey, I need to get to know you to understand where to start. And that just wasn't happening in medicine. I remember in 2010 was like when the ACA, or Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was passed. And so we were watching all of these rollouts come out, right? And so I started to kind of understand like, wow, this is really powerful. We haven't had like massive healthcare reform, honestly, since like the 1960s, when Social Security and Medicare and welfare and Medicaid had been passed. But we're watching on these rollouts, and I'm seeing the adoption of electronic health records, right? So I'm working in one hospital, and then I work in another hospital, and they have different systems. And so if I have to request records from someone else, it's not a direct transfer, computer transfer. You'd think that if it's electronic, that's kind of the idea, but they're not compatible. So not only do you have to learn all of these different systems, they're not compatible, and we were still faxing. Yes, we still fax. And it's crazy to me because if you dial one wrong number, that's a HIPAA violation. And so I was just always nervous. I was like, I better like double, triple, quadruple check. So anyway, the system is broken, right? Like we don't have the resources, we don't have the focus on community, and it there's a mismatch in what we think we can offer as providers versus what the communities actually understand, or what they're experiencing. And so, I remember one of these conversations that I had where, we had a patient and she did not like refill her script. And so I was talking to one of the other medical students, and I was like, oh, what happened? She's like, oh, well, she just didn't want to take it anymore. And I was like, oh, that's kind of odd. So I went to go talk to her. And actually what had happened was that this woman was unable to get a refill because it required her to get a paper script, which meant she had to take the day off from work, which meant she had to find childcare, which meant she had to find transportation. And she just couldn't do that. And so what did she do? She just stopped taking her medication. Right. And this is not like a consequence of like, I don't want to take this. This is a consequence of circumstance, right? Like these are things that people just cannot control, and just people kind of choose the lesser, whatever is least impactful and harmful to their day. And that is how a lot of people function. And we saw that like, really, really take off, even be amplified even more during COVID. And I was just watching this and I was like, what are we doing? I don't understand this. And maybe it's because I didn't understand it that I kept asking these questions.
Well, and tell me how you got from, being in hospital as a doctor, trying to serve your community and understand your community, to having this interest in substance usage impacts on your community, and how you ended up at NAPAFASA.
Yeah. So, I always tell people like I grew up with people who did drugs, who sold drugs, who made drugs. I'm not gonna say they are, it's not important, but they were my friends, like they were my community. And it was normal. It was normal to me, and it was just a part of life. And I'm also part of the LGBTQ plus community. And there is a lot of substance use and binge drinking in the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, it's June now, so shout out Pride. It's
Whoop,
happy
whoop.
Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride, everyone. And I think you make a good point. And like, let's celebrate the survival, right? And like, let's celebrate survival and then moving into thrive as communities, because we know that marginalized communities that have ACEs, poverty, violence, drugs, instabilities, lack of access, those are not your fault. It's not, those are not what define you. Those are the obstacles that we face having, like, I grew up super poor and super involved in communities that had so many, so many marks against them. I think that's a huge call out, that when it's, we don't normalize the use of drugs. It's normal because our communities are hurting.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so many ways to approach it, right? Like, do you just ban drugs? Like, we know that, does that work? does abstinence really work, right? Like, what does it really look like? And the thing is that, I understood intrinsically and just kind of growing up around my community and in my community that, like, obviously substance use disorder and getting to the point of addiction is, there are roots to it. It's not that, you don't, we have to focus on the root cause of the issue, which are, as you said, the ACEs, right? Like, why are people suffering so much, right? Because the thing is, it's like, really, it's, if we don't have the support systems for people to do well, to be well, and to get well, and to take accountability for their own health, then we are really robbing them of the chance to get out of these really, really sometimes desperate situations. And so kind of just coming back to your question, how did I go from medicine to public health? Well, for me, I experienced some really like severe mental health challenges in medical school. So I never had, surprisingly, access to mental health care when I was young. My medical school was very kind enough to provide a psychiatrist and a psychologist, because knowing how the hard medical school was. And so I was like, wow, let me try this. This is the first time, because, to be honest, I had depression, severe depression, when I was a teenager. And, my mom had taken me to the doctor. She started to get really concerned because I had suicidal ideation. And my doctor, who was a old school doctor from Philippines, she's like, oh yeah, it's normal. And so I just assumed, like, oh, I guess, like, I just have this disposition to feel terrible. And that's what I assumed. And so when I started going to therapy, it was like the trauma opened, and it was like I could not control it, because it was like I had experienced so much childhood and adult trauma that it was like the shutters had just fallen off and I saw everything for the first time, and I was jarred. I felt like I lost my footing. And at the same time, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and I didn't know what was I doing, so I really started to fall into some kind of like depression. I was just so scared.
I like to talk a lot about like what is real self-care and what is real mental and physical wellness, what is holistic wellness, and how do we engage in those things. And you make a good point here, which is it can be really scary and really hard to actually give yourself the resources and the tools like therapy. It can be hard to step into that and open up that box that you've kept closed for so long, and then navigate the world like, oh yeah, that wasn't a crazy therapy session. I'm normal.
Right? Like, I mean, I probably spent the first year of therapy like crying every single session. And it was so much to do during medical school, and while I was grieving what had happened, like with my mother. Fortunately, she survived, she's in remission. But like, I just remember thinking that oh my God, am I not going to get the chance to fix this relationship with my mother? Like, is this it for me? Like, am I going to lose this chance? And so I was like, do I like, do I pause school? What do I do? And I went to UC Irvine. My parents at the time were living in Orange County, so they were not far. But this is how busy I was. I only visited every few months to go see my mother, and I felt incredibly guilty. And my mom, she would call me. She's like, no, I know you're really, really busy. I understand. I'm just glad you called. Fortunately, my dad really stepped up and took care of her. My aunt was able to also take some time to take care of my mom and drive her around. But like I was living literally like 20 miles from my mom, not able to see her, just working at the hospital. And I mean, I even remember the day when she called me. It was like 8 a.m, and I was working in the neonatal ward, and she called me at around 8, and I was like, oh, this is unusual. My mom never calls at this time because she knows I'm already at the hospital. And she's like, oh, you remember that biopsy that I took? And I was like, I forgot about it. I totally forgot. She mentioned it because, I'm just kind of like in my own world of school. And she's like, well, it came back that I have cancer. And it was like this wave just came over me. And, even though like it happened to my mom's now, like she's okay, like it was so much emotion to go through. And I just remember like crying in the bathroom. I was in the bathroom, and and she's like, okay, well, I just want to let you know because I know like you wanted me to tell you. And I just remember like just kind of taking 10 minutes to compose myself in the bathroom and then walking out and continuing. And I just kept thinking like, where is this sympathy for like people who are training? Like I remember speaking to like my professors and thinking I don't know what to do there. But the thing is, the reality in medicine is that if you take a break in medical school, if for any reason, right, it's a red flag. And
Let's talk about this for a minute, Marielle, because like, we know that balance and whole person wellness is so important, and that our families are so important to us, and our friends, our lives are so important to us. And the framework of and I'm just going to say it, the framework of a patriarchal society makes us sacrifice. And like my heart is like hurting just saying it. It makes us sacrifice what's so important to us. And it's so devastating that these traumatic moments in our lives have to happen for us to assess, what do we do? How do we do this? And then you have to make these choices that are huge. And it's there's no easy way to navigate any of that. And you're always sacrificing something for what you find important. That is a problem that we have, that we can't be whole people at work, that we can't share and find empathy and support when we need it. The fact that you felt so alone in this moment of need and sadness, and you had to go and just pretend like nothing was happening. That's why we have a mental health crisis in our country.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, and it didn't really occur to me until I really left medicine, and practice. And I remember like matching into surgery, but at the time I had been like diagnosed with bipolar type 2 disorder, which is like the less severe form. And surprisingly or unsurprisingly, it wasn't working, the medications that I was given. And I was given so much, and they're like, well, it's not working, let's just keep bumping it up. And so what happened, right? Like I started to develop side effects from this medication. I was having even more poor sleep, and I lost the sense of who I was because all I could think about was I am lost in this medication. I would look in the mirror and I couldn't even recognize myself, right? I just felt numb. And at a certain point, like I think it was even just like I was taking migraine medication and I started to develop suicidal ideation. And at this point, I said, I can't go through this again. I need to go off them. And so I tapered myself off very, very slowly against the advice of my psychiatrist at the time. Um, and I just decided like there has to be a better way. And I was off medication for, well, ever since then. And I just had to trust. And I'm not saying that medication isn't helpful, right? Like,
Well,
but for
you
me,
when we first met, you know, and this is the important piece. It's having somebody know you in a way that knows how to help you work through what's best for you.
yeah.
And when we first met, you had said one of the reasons that you ended up at NAPAFASA is because you wanted to bring in voices with actual experience to solve the most pressing issues in communities. And then the other thing that you had said is that one of your biggest advocacy hopes that you put a lot of your effort into is identifying what is health equity and can it be achieved?
Mm, yeah. Yeah, and I think it's going to take bringing people's stories into the foreground, right, to really understand what that looks like, right? And this is just kind of touching back to what you said. For the longest time, right? Like health has been defined by white patriarchy. And that is just not the majority of people, right? And that has impacted all of healthcare. I mean, obviously, it's impacted a lot of our systems in the US, but if we're just strictly talking healthcare and health adjacent things, like we're talking about research, we're talking about like really racist, terrible experiments conducted on communities of color, right? That's a Tuskegee experiment. And there's so many other unethical ways that we've obtained this information and how we find it. And even though that has, improved over history, right? And now we have like ethical boards and things like that. The issue is now we have to really critique whether that data still stands true now that we're having more stories and more people are getting the capacity and the ability to speak out and share like, hey, this doesn't actually reflect me or my experience or my community. Let me share. And so I think that's I think that's really, really powerful. And I think we saw an acceleration of that during COVID because I'm just going to say it's social media, social media in some sense is really, really terrible because of the potential for the spread of misinformation. But suddenly, since we were all turned inward during this global pandemic, we're spending all this time online realizing, hey, that person, like thousands of miles away from me, is actually experiencing the same thing. Now let's like magnify that. And suddenly we're realizing like, oh, this is what's happening. This is the community pain that we're all feeling and all of these systemic intersections. And I think it's really relevant to the point of storytelling.
Absolutely. You made me think of something that I haven't really thought about deeply before, which is, we're basing a lot of medical practices and knowledge on research, and research is studies, right? Research is the driver of what these studies are that create fact or create theory. That these studies we haven't really analyzed them to say, does this reflect the people, or is this a biased study from a limited belief system and a limited knowledge base from decades ago? Tell me how you think that impacts health equity, and tell me what you think health equity is.
Yeah. Um, the perspective of the research and the storytelling and the practices that we have in healthcare and mental health, um when let me kind of take a step back. So as people, right, we kind of just step a little bit out of our comfort zone, right? We always come from our experiences. The questions that we ask often come from within. And so I often say that research is always just pushing what you know. Well, if you have a majority of like white men who are the researchers, right? And I'm not saying this like there's no malice that I'm saying in this scenario, but as a white man, there's only so much that you can say, right? Just like as an Asian woman who's an immigrant, like I can only really speak on my experience. And so when we have a very, very selective or like small group of people that don't represent, the large majority who are leading these studies and leading these practices, and deciding what is valid and what is not, we are excluding so many more people and how to actually better meet them where they are.
Learners in this group, we are experts in our fields, but we're always looking to better ourselves. Can you recommend a book, a podcast, or a resource that you think would help our listeners on their own journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really love All About Love by Bell Hooks. And the reason why I think this is really relevant to our conversation and your leadership program is, we really have to kind of think about our relationship to ourselves. What does love look like for ourselves? What does love look like on a romantic level? What does love look like on a community level, on a platonic level, right? There's so many forms of love. And, of course, we often think about romantic love and our juxtaposition to masculine people or men, right? And there's a lot of dialogue going, around about what it means to have these gender roles, right? And how do we actually find each other when women have been doing so much work for so long because we've had to, right? And now that we have all this opportunity to buy our own houses, get our own credit cards, have our own careers, a lot of men are just kind of thinking like, well, what do I do, and again, like it's a patriarchal system that has also trapped all of us, right? And so I think that this book really just starts to pick at the questions of like, why is that, right? How do we really navigate what about masculinity is healthy and important, and what about patriarchy is harmful? And I think we really have to inquire that, because what does it mean to be a leader? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a femme? You really have to start doing the work from within, and also recognizing the masculinity in ourselves.
Well, I love the conversation today. I have so much to go and reflect upon and think upon, and I've just really enjoyed the time together, Marielle.
Thank you. Likewise.
Really.
Thank you. I've had a great time, and I just appreciate your questions and really the thoughtfulness that you have behind all of this. So thank you. Thanks for letting me be part of it.
Wonderful. You can find more information on Dr. Marielle Reataza at NAPAFASA.org, and you can also find her on LinkedIn. We'll give you some of the links in our description on this podcast, and we appreciate everyone being here today. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us today in the Executives Lounge, where we bust open the doors, slam through the ceilings, and make sure that we have a spot at the table and that we are the lounge. I am Christine Fauner, your executive leadership expert, continuously looking for those executive leaders that seek community, continuous learning, and have a desire to find the next adventure. Join us next time. Join our Facebook group, Roam Your Soul, and you can also find us on Instagram at Roam Your Soul. And don't forget to check out the website for upcoming adventures, www.roamyoursoul.com. And if you're looking for that next executive level leadership coach, you can find me at roamyoursoul.com/Christine Fauner Coaching.